In a fading Nevada town where dust settles on broken promises, 8-year-old Declan Ashford lived in the shadow of a hospital room. His mother, Lynette, worked double shifts at the county diner, while Declan fought a silent battle against a rare blood disorder that kept him tethered to IV lines and hushed doctor's appointments. One scorching afternoon outside the clinic, Declan sat alone on a bench, watching the world blur past. That's when he heard them, the rumble of engines that made the ground tremble. 17 motorcycles rolled through Main Street, leather vests catching sunlight, chrome gleaming like liquid silver. At the front rode Garrett Flint Mercer, a man whose face told stories of deserts crossed and promises kept. When Declan's medication fell from his mother's bag, Flint stopped. In that 5-minute encounter, helping retrieve scattered pills, kneeling in gravel to meet the boy's eyes, something shifted. Declan saw not danger, but kinship. Before they left, the boy pressed a hand-drawn invitation into Flint's calloused palm. "My birthday, please come, nobody else will." 3 months later, at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday, Flint made a call that would ripple across state lines. By noon, 93 bikers stood ready. What began as one man honoring a child's wish became a convoy of redemption. Veterans, ex-cons, mechanics, fathers who'd lost children, men carrying their own scars. They rode not for glory, but for a boy who asked when no one else believed anyone would come. What happened on Declan's 9th birthday in that small Nevada town would challenge everything the community believed about who deserves compassion, what family truly means, and how one kept promise can rewrite the ending of 2 lives forever. The invitation was wrinkled, drawn in blue crayon on the back of a hospital discharge form. Garrett Flint Mercer held it between his thumb and forefinger, sitting alone in his garage at 6:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning that smelled of motor oil and old leather. Outside, Nevada stretched silent and pale before sunrise. If you're watching this, know that some promises are written in ink that never fades. Even when the world forgets they were made, the paper trembled slightly in his grip. Not from his hands. Those had steadied long ago during years that taught him stillness under fire, but from the weight of what it represented. A child's hope, preserved through 3 months of waiting. The words were simple, misspelled in places. "My birthday, September 14th. Please come. Nobody else will." Declan Flint remembered the day they'd met. Late June, outside Henderson County Clinic. He'd been passing through with his crew, 17 riders, heading north after a Veterans Memorial run in Arizona. They'd stopped for water and gas. That's when he'd seen the kid, small for his age, maybe 7 or 8, sitting alone on a concrete bench while his mother argued with someone inside through the glass doors. Medical paperwork scattered across the bench, pill bottles, insurance forms. The boy's arms were thin, marked with bruises that spoke of frequent blood draws. His eyes held that particular exhaustion that comes not from tiredness, but from fighting battles no child should know. When the wind caught the papers, Flint had stopped to help. Simple as that. Kneeling in gravel, gathering prescriptions and appointment cards, while the boy watched him with careful intensity. "You're a real biker," Declan had said. Not a question, an observation. "Yeah." Flint had handed back the papers. "You okay, kid?" The boy had nodded, but his eyes told different stories. Then, before Flint could stand, small fingers pressed something into his palm. The invitation, already wrinkled even then, already containing 3 months of hope compressed into crayon and paper. "I don't have friends," Declan had said quietly. "Mom says people are scared of me because I'm sick. My birthday's in September. Will you come?" Flint had looked into those eyes. Old eyes in a young face, eyes that had learned not to expect yes, and something in his chest had shifted. He'd served in places where promises were currency more valuable than gold. where your word was the only thing that couldn't be taken by force or circumstance. He'd learned that lesson in dust and blood. "I'll be there," he'd said. Now, September 14th had arrived. Saturday, the boy's 9th birthday. Flint had kept the invitation in his vest pocket for 3 months, feeling it against his ribs every time he rode. A small weight that grew heavier with each passing day. He looked at his phone. 6:52 a.m. The party started at noon, according to the invitation. Henderson was 47 miles northwest, an hour's ride, maybe less if he pushed it. But something about this felt wrong if he rode alone. This wasn't about him keeping a promise. This was about showing a kid that when someone says they'll come, they come, and they don't come alone. Flint stood, folded the invitation carefully, and made the first call. Ronan Ironside picked up on the second ring. "It's early, Flint. Remember the kid from June, outside the clinic?" A pause. "The sick one, with the drawings?" "His birthday's today. I'm going." Another pause, longer. Then, "Where and when?" "My place, 8:30. Spread the word." "How many you want?" Flint looked at the invitation again. At the crayon lines, the misspelled words, the small hope compressed into paper. "Everyone who can ride." By 8:15 a.m., his driveway was full. By 8:45, the street was lined with motorcycles. Men in leather vests, women with road-worn faces, all carrying the same understanding. Sometimes the most important rides aren't the longest or the fastest. Sometimes they're just 47 miles to show a kid that someone remembered. Cade arrived with his wife, Maren. Silas rolled in from Reno. Bridger came straight from a night shift at the foundry, still wearing steel-toed boots. They kept coming, faces marked by sun and choices, hands scarred by work and war, hearts heavy with their own stories of loss and survival. By 9:30 a.m., 93 motorcycles idled in formation. The sound was cathedral deep, earth-shaking. Neighbors watched from windows, uncertain whether to be afraid or awed. Flint stood at the front, the invitation still in his hand. He raised it once, let them all see it, then tucked it back against his heart. "Let's ride," he said. They moved like thunder given direction. Chrome caught morning light. Leather creaked in rhythm with engines. The sound reached ahead of them, a rolling promise that shook windows and turned heads in every town they passed through. In Henderson, in a small house at the end of Oak Ridge Street, Declan Ashford sat by a window, decorated with streamers his mother had hung at dawn. A cake waited on the kitchen counter. 9 candles, unlit. His mother had invited his class, 24 children. Nobody had confirmed, but Declan wasn't watching the driveway for classmates. He was watching the horizon, where dust rose like a promise being kept. Lynette Ashford had learned to measure time in heartbeats and hospital visits. 3 years since the diagnosis, 37 bone marrow tests, 14 blood transfusions. Countless mornings waking to check if her son was still breathing, still fighting, still here. She stood at the kitchen counter now, hands pressed flat against cheap laminate, trying to steady herself. The birthday cake sat beside her, chocolate with vanilla frosting, Declan's favorite. She'd made it at 5:00 a.m., before her shift at the diner started. Using ingredients she'd stretched her budget to afford, 9 candles waited in a drawer, still in their package. Through the doorway, she could see Declan sitting by the living room window. He'd been there since 7:30, watching, not moving, just waiting with that particular stillness that children develop when they've been disappointed enough times to stop showing hope on their faces. "Baby, you want breakfast?" she called, keeping her voice light. "Not hungry?" His eyes never left the window. Lynette's chest tightened. She'd sent the invitations herself 3 weeks ago. Hand-delivered them to every child in Declan's 3rd grade class. Mrs. Patterson, his teacher, had promised to remind everyone. The party was set for noon to 3:00 p.m. A Saturday afternoon that should have been filled with children's laughter, games in the small backyard, the chaos of 9-year-olds hopped up on cake and joy. But her phone had stayed silent. No RSVPs, no polite declines, just silence that spoke louder than words. She knew why. Henderson was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone's business. They knew about Declan's condition. Chronic myelogenous leukemia, the doctors called it. They knew about the treatments, the medications, the days he missed school. They knew, and they were afraid. Not of him exactly, but of what he represented. Fragility, mortality, the reminder that children could be breakable. Parents kept their kids at a distance. Not maliciously, Lynette told herself, just carefully, cautiously. As if illness might be catching, or as if getting close to Declan meant accepting that their own children weren't invincible. "Mom." Declan's voice was quiet. "What time is it?" "9:40, honey. They'll come." He said it like a prayer, like if he believed hard enough it would be true. Lynette's throat burned. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, to tell him that it didn't matter if nobody came, that she loved him enough for 1,000 friends. But she'd learned that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is lower a child's expectations before they're proven wrong. So she stayed in the kitchen, gripping the counter, and let him keep his hope a little longer. The truth was, she'd stopped believing in the party days ago. But there was one thing Declan had mentioned, one impossible thing that kept him glued to that window: the bikers. She remembered that day in June. She'd been arguing with the clinic administrator about a bill they claimed wasn't covered, her voice rising in frustration and fear as numbers she couldn't afford stacked higher. Declan had been sitting outside, too tired to stand, too used to waiting. When she'd finally emerged, papers clutched in white-knuckled hands, she'd found her son talking to a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a different world. Tall, weathered, wearing a leather vest marked with patches she didn't recognize. His motorcycle was parked nearby, chrome gleaming in the brutal June sun. Her first instinct had been fear, the automatic response of a mother protecting her sick child. But then she'd seen Declan's face. He was smiling, actually smiling in a way he hadn't in months. The man had stood when he saw her, nodded once with respectful distance, and walked back to his motorcycle. As he'd left, Declan had waved, clutching something in his small fist. "What was that about?" she'd asked. "He helped pick up my papers. I invited him to my birthday." Declan had shown her the invitation, wrinkled, crayon-marked, impossibly earnest. Lynette's heart had sunk. "Baby, I don't think—" "He said he'd come, Mom. He promised." She'd wanted to tell him that strangers don't keep promises to children they meet once on hot sidewalks, that men on motorcycles have better things to do than remember a sick kid's birthday. That hope like that only led to bigger disappointments. But Declan had tucked the invitation back in his pocket with such careful certainty that she said nothing. Just made a mental note to be extra gentle when noon came and went, with no rumbling engines, no leather-clad stranger keeping an impossible promise. Now it was 9:47 a.m. 2 hours and 13 minutes until the party officially started. The streamers hung limp in still air. The cake sat perfect and untouched. The backyard was set up with borrowed folding chairs and a card table decorated with more streamers, all of it looking increasingly pathetic as the morning stretched on. Lynette took a breath and walked to the living room. She sat beside Declan, careful not to block his view of the window. "Honey, I need to tell you something." He looked at her then, and she saw everything in his eyes. He already knew that his classmates weren't coming, knew that the party would be just the two of them, like always. But there was still that one spark, that one thread of possibility he was clinging to. "The biker," he whispered. "He'll come, right, Mom?" He promised. Lynette opened her mouth to prepare him, to cushion the fall that was coming. But before she could speak, something changed. The air itself seemed to shift. A sound rose from somewhere distant, low and growing, deep enough to feel in the chest before the ears registered it. Declan's head snapped toward the window. "Mom, do you hear that?" She did. A rumble like distant thunder, except the sky was clear and blue. The sound grew louder, closer, impossible to ignore. It shook the windows in their frames, made the streamers flutter. Declan pressed his face against the glass. "Mom, Mom, look." Lynette stood and looked out the window. What she saw made her breath stop. They came from the east, where the morning sun turned chrome into liquid fire. Not one motorcycle, not two. A formation that stretched back along the highway like a river of thunder and steel. 93 motorcycles moving in perfect coordination, their engines creating a sound that reached into your chest and made your heart synchronize to their rhythm. At the front rode Garrett Flint Mercer. The invitation pressed against his ribs, 57 miles of highway behind him, and one promise about to be kept. Beside him, Ronan Ironside kept pace, his face set in the particular expression of a man who'd seen enough of life to know when something mattered. Behind them, row after row of riders, men and women whose own scars had taught them the weight of a child's hope. In Henderson, people stopped what they were doing, stopped mowing lawns, stopped washing cars, stopped conversations mid-sentence to stare at the approaching formation. The sound preceded them by minutes, a rolling announcement that something unprecedented was arriving in their quiet town. Inside the small house on Oak Ridge Street, Declan's face was pressed so hard against the window that it left a mark on his forehead. His mother stood frozen behind him, one hand over her mouth, unable to process what she was seeing. "He came," Declan whispered. Then louder, "Mom, he came! He really came!" The formation slowed as it reached Oak Ridge. Flint raised one gloved hand, and the motorcycles behind him responded like a single organism, engines throttling down, spacing adjusting. They lined both sides of the narrow street, a double row of chrome and leather that transformed the residential block into something else entirely. Something that looked like respect made tangible. Neighbors emerged onto porches. Mrs. Patterson, Declan's teacher, stood in her doorway 3 houses down, hand shading her eyes. The Hendersons from next door stepped into their yard, their 2 children, both in Declan's class, staring with mouths open. Flint stopped directly in front of Declan's house and killed his engine. The sudden silence was almost as profound as the noise had been. In that stillness, you could hear birds again, wind in trees, the small sounds of a Saturday morning, but everything felt different, charged with possibility. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, pulled off his gloves and tucked them in his belt, met the eyes of the small face pressed against the window and nodded once. Then he walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. Lynette opened it before he could knock. She stood there, one arm protectively around Declan, trying to find words for a moment that had no script. "You came," she said finally, "made a promise." Flint's voice was rough, worn smooth by wind and years. "This is Declan's day, ma'am, if you'll have us." Behind him, 92 other riders had dismounted. They stood by their motorcycles in the morning sun, a silent assembly of the hardened and the hopeful. Some wore colors that marked them as members of motorcycle clubs. Others rode independent. All of them carried the same expression, witnesses to a promise being kept. Declan pushed past his mother and stepped onto the porch. His thin arms and the medical port visible at his collarbone suddenly seemed less fragile in the presence of all that raw loyalty. He looked at Flint, then at the rows of motorcycles, then back at Flint. "You remembered," the boy said. "I kept it here." Flint tapped his vest over his heart. "Every ride, 93 days. Felt it every mile." Declan's face crumpled, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of being remembered, of mattering enough for this. Tears tracked down his face as he stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around Flint's waist. The big man's hands hovered for a moment, then settled gently on the boy's shoulders. "Happy birthday, kid," Flint said quietly. Behind them, the other riders approached. Not rushing, not overwhelming, but coming forward one by one, or in small groups. They carried things, gifts wrapped in whatever they'd had available. A baseball glove from Silas, a model airplane kit from Cade, books and toys and trinkets, each one carried by someone who remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, forgotten, dismissed as unimportant. Bridger, the foundry worker still in his steel-toed boots, knelt down to Declan's level. "Got you something, birthday boy." He held out a small leather bracelet stamped with the words, "Promises kept." Ma and Cade's wife presented a photo album. "For today," she said, "so you remember this." They kept coming, this assembly of the unexpected, the overlooked, the ones society had written off or written around. They came to honor a 9-year-old who'd invited them when no one else would come. They came because someone had kept their word, and in doing so, reminded them all why that mattered. Lynette stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face, watching her son be surrounded not by classmates who'd been too afraid to come, but by strangers who'd ridden nearly 60 miles to prove that promises still meant something. "I don't understand," she said to Flint. "Why did you all come?" He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and still chose to see the good. "Because he asked, because we know what it's like to be alone, and because sometimes keeping a promise to a kid is the only way to remember that the world can still be good." Around them, Henderson was transforming. Neighbors who'd stayed away were creeping closer. Children who'd ignored Declan's invitations were watching from yards and driveways. The Hendersons' daughter, Emma, took a tentative step toward the gathering, drawn by something she didn't have words for yet. Mrs. Patterson approached slowly, her teacher's instinct recognizing a moment of profound education. "Declan," she called. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." He turned, still held in the protective circle of 93 bikers, and waved. His smile could have powered the sun. "And now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you." By 10:30 a.m., Oak Ridge Street had become something Henderson had never seen before. What started as one boy's birthday party had evolved into an event that drew the entire neighborhood into its orbit. The bikers moved with surprising gentleness, transforming Lynette's small backyard into something magical. Silas, who'd spent 20 years in the Marines before the road called him, coordinated the setup with military precision. Within 30 minutes, the borrowed card table was replaced by a larger one carried from someone's truck. The few folding chairs multiplied as riders went back to their bikes and returned with camping chairs, coolers and supplies that materialized as if they'd planned for this all along. Ronan Ironside, whose hands bore scars from a decade of mechanic work, set up a small grill he'd strapped to his bike. "Kid deserves more than cake," he muttered, firing up charcoal. Within minutes, the smell of hamburgers filled the air, mixing with Nevada dust and morning warmth. Declan moved through it all in a daze. Every few steps, someone new stopped to shake his hand, to ruffle his hair, to treat him not as the fragile, sick kid, but as the birthday boy who deserved this. His thin face glowed with something more healing than any medicine could provide. "You play baseball?" Bridger asked, tossing the glove he'd brought underhand to Declan. "Never really learned." Declan caught it awkwardly, the leather still stiff and new. "Perfect time to start." Bridger grabbed a worn ball from his pocket. "Let's see what you got." They moved to a clear patch of yard. Bridger positioned himself about 15 feet away and tossed the ball gently. Declan caught it against his chest more than in the glove, but the grin on his face made it a victory. "Again!" the boy called, and again, and again. Each throw a little better, each catch a small triumph witnessed by men and women who understood that strength wasn't just about physical power, it was about showing up. Trying, refusing to quit, even when your body argued otherwise. Lynette watched from the porch, still processing. Maren sat beside her, offering coffee from a thermos. "I don't know how to thank you all," Lynette said quietly. "I don't even know your names. My son gave an invitation to a stranger, and now 93 strangers are crashing his party." Maren smiled. "Honey, we're not strangers. We're family he hadn't met yet. But why? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Maren was quiet for a moment, watching her husband Cade show Declan how to adjust his grip on the baseball. 5 years ago, my son would have been Declan's age, would have been excited about birthdays and baseball gloves and having friends over. The past tense landed heavy. "I'm sorry," Lynette whispered. "Cancer took him." Maren's voice was steady, tempered by time, and grief worked through. "We know what it's like to watch your child fight battles he shouldn't have to fight. We know what it's like to see other parents pull their kids away, as if pain might be catching, and we know what one person showing up can mean." She turned to face Lynette. "Flint kept his promise, but we all came because we needed to remember that the world still has room for this, for keeping your word, for showing a kid he matters." Inside the house, Flint had found the birthday cake on the kitchen counter. He stood looking at it, simple chocolate with vanilla frosting, decorated with precision that spoke of a mother's love, measured in pre-dawn hours and stretched budgets. "Pretty cake," a voice said behind him. He turned. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-40s, with the careful posture of someone used to authority. The teacher, if he remembered right. Patterson. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, nodding. "Mr. just Flint." She stepped into the kitchen, studying him with the assessing gaze teachers develop. "I should have made sure the other children came. I knew about the invitations. I reminded them. But I didn't push," Flint finished. "Didn't want to force parents who were uncomfortable." She looked at him sharply. "You understand that part?" "I understand a lot of things, ma'am, including how easy it is to let the hard choices slide by because they're complicated." He picked up one of the 9 candles from the drawer. "But simple things matter most. A kid asks you to come to his birthday. You come. Everything else is just noise." Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. I was worried about how parents would react, about the liability of him being around other children during his treatments, about making people uncomfortable." She swallowed hard. "I chose comfort over doing what was right." "So fix it," Flint said simply. "Today's not over." She looked at him, then out the window to where Declan was now surrounded by bikers, being taught how to throw a proper curveball by Bridger. "You're right," she said. "Excuse me." She left through the front door. Flint watched as she walked with purpose down the street, stopping at houses, knocking on doors. He couldn't hear what she said, but he could see the effect. Doors opened. Parents listened. And slowly, tentatively, children emerged. By 11:00 a.m., Emma Henderson arrived with her younger brother, carrying a hastily wrapped present. Then came Marcus Chen from down the block, then the Willis twins. One by one or in small groups, Declan's classmates filtered into the yard, drawn by the spectacle of motorcycles and the growing sense that something important was happening. Declan saw them coming and froze, the baseball still in his glove. For a moment, uncertainty crossed his face. These were the kids who'd ignored his invitation, who'd kept their distance in school hallways, who'd made him feel invisible. Flint appeared beside him, one hand on his shoulder. "Your party, kid. Your choice who stays." Declan looked up at him, then back at his approaching classmates. Something shifted in his expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but something more mature. Understanding, maybe. Or grace. "Hi, Emma," he called. "Want to play catch?" Emma's face lit up with relief. "Yeah, happy birthday, Declan." The dam broke. Children flooded into the yard, mixing with the bikers in ways that would have been unthinkable 2 hours ago. Cade organized a throwing competition. Silas told exaggerated road trip stories that had kids laughing. Maren took photos relentlessly, documenting every moment. By 11:45, when Ronan declared the burgers ready, the backyard was packed. 24 classmates, 93 bikers, neighbors who'd crept closer and somehow ended up staying. Nearly 120 people gathered in a small yard in Henderson, Nevada, because one man kept a promise and reminded everyone else what that looked like. Lynette stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming freely now, no longer trying to hide them. Her son, her fragile, brave, overlooked son, was surrounded by more love than she'd dared hope for. Not the love she'd begged for from indifferent parents, but real love. Chosen love. Love that showed up. Flint found her in the crowd. "Ma'am, if it's all right, we'd like to do something." "Anything," she said. "You've already given us everything." He nodded to Ronan, who produced a guitar from somewhere, because, of course, these impossible men traveled with musical instruments. The crowd quieted as Ronan began to play, something slow and wordless that sounded like roads traveled and promises kept. Then, in voices rough and unused to singing, but sincere in ways that made them beautiful, 93 bikers began to sing "Happy Birthday." They sang it like a benediction, like a promise, like a reminder that the world still had room for joy if you were brave enough to show up for it. The birthday song ended, but its echo seemed to hang in the desert air. 93 voices rough with road dust and redemption, mixed with the higher, clearer voices of children who were learning what loyalty looked like. Declan stood in front of the cake, 9 candles flickering in the late morning breeze. His face glowed, not just from the candlelight, but from something deeper. For a boy who'd spent 3 years being treated like he was made of glass, being surrounded by people who saw him as strong enough to matter, it rewrote something fundamental in his understanding of himself. "Make a wish, baby," Lynette whispered, her hands on his shoulders. He closed his eyes. The yard fell silent. Bikers, classmates, neighbors, all holding their breath. In that moment, Declan Ashford carried the hopes of everyone watching. Each person projected their own wishes onto that small figure. Let him be healthy. Let him know joy. Let this day mean he'll never feel alone again. He opened his eyes and blew. All 9 candles extinguished in one breath. The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, whistles that could wake the dead. Bridger lifted Declan onto his shoulders, parading him around the yard like a championship trophy. The boy's laughter rang clear and bright, a sound his mother hadn't heard enough of in 3 years. Cade cut the cake with exaggerated ceremony, presenting the first piece to Declan with a flourish that made the children giggle. Plates circulated. Chocolate cake with vanilla frosting made with pre-dawn love disappeared in minutes, each person remarking that it was the best they'd ever tasted, and meaning it because food tastes different when it's seasoned with significance. Emma Henderson, the neighbor girl who'd been too scared to RSVP, sat beside Declan on the porch steps. "This is the coolest party ever," she said, watching Silas teach Marcus Chen how to identify different motorcycle makes and models. "Yeah." Declan took another bite of cake. "I thought nobody would come." "I'm sorry I didn't say I would." Emma's voice was small. "My mom said you might be too sick to have a party, that maybe we shouldn't come because I might make everyone sad." Declan finished for her. He'd heard variations of this before. Yeah, she looked at her feet. But that was stupid. You're not sad. You're really brave. I don't always feel brave, but you are. She gestured at the yard full of bikers. You asked them to come, even though you didn't know if they would. That's brave. From across the yard, Flint watched this exchange. Ronan settled beside him, guitar now resting against the fence. Kids teaching them something, Ronan observed. Yeah. Flint took a sip of the coffee Marin had pressed into his hands. Teaching them that sick doesn't mean weak. Different doesn't mean less. Think it'll stick. With some, others will forget tomorrow. Flint was pragmatic about human nature. But today mattered. For him, for them. That's enough. You think about having kids? Ronan asked. You're good with them. Flint was quiet for a long moment. Road doesn't leave room for that, but days like this make me wonder what I'm riding away from instead of toward. Before Ronan could respond, a commotion erupted near the front yard, voices raised, not in anger, but in protest. Both men were on their feet instantly, moving toward the sound with the fluid alertness of those accustomed to trouble. They found Mrs. Patterson blocking someone from entering the backyard. A man in his 40s, wearing expensive casual clothes that screamed weekend warrior pretending to be relaxed. Behind him stood a woman filming on her phone, and another man holding what looked like professional recording equipment. I'm telling you, you can't just barge in here, Mrs. Patterson was saying, her teacher voice in full force. This is a private party. It's a public spectacle, the man countered. 93 bikers showing up in a residential neighborhood. That's news. I'm Derek Morrison, Henderson Gazette. We have a right to document this. You have a right to get lost, Bridger growled, appearing on Flint's left. Several other riders materialized as if summoned, forming a wall between the journalists and the party. Derek Morrison assessed the situation and changed tactics, switching to a sympathetic smile. Look, this is a great human interest story. Local boy, birthday party, bikers with hearts of gold. Everyone loves that. We just want to get some photos, maybe interview the kid. No. Flint's voice cut through the negotiations like a blade. One word, flat and final. Morrison turned to him. And you are? The guy telling you to leave. Are you threatening me? Stating facts. This is a private residence. You weren't invited. Leave. Morrison's friendly mask slipped. You can't control the narrative on this. It's going to get out. I can make you all look good, or I can write about how a motorcycle gang intimidated a journalist. Your choice. Lynette appeared at the edge of the gathering, drawn by the tension. She looked at Morrison, at the camera, at her son visible through the crowd, still sitting with Emma, unaware that his joy was about to be packaged and sold. Is there a problem? She asked quietly. Miss Ashford? Morrison's smile returned. Derek Morrison, Henderson Gazette. Congratulations on your son's wonderful birthday. We'd love to feature this story. Boy with cancer, community coming together, the triumph of human spirit. It would really raise awareness for childhood leukemia research. Lynette's expression didn't change, but something hardened in her eyes. My son doesn't have cancer. Oh, my apologies, the blood disorder, I meant... My son is not your human interest story. His medical condition is not your awareness campaign. And his birthday party, the one day he gets to feel normal and celebrated and surrounded by people who chose to be here, is not your content. Ma'am, with all respect, this story is going to get out. Wouldn't you rather control how it's told? I'd rather you respect my son's privacy and leave. Her voice never rose, but steel ran through it. The steel of 3 years fighting insurance companies, pushy doctors, and well-meaning but invasive strangers. Now! Morrison looked around at the ring of bikers, at the teacher still blocking the gate, at the mother who'd just drawn a line he couldn't cross. He calculated quickly. Fine. But don't be surprised when this shows up on social media. Half the neighborhood is posting about this already." He gestured to his crew, and they retreated toward a van parked down the street. The tension deflated slowly. Lynette sagged slightly, and Maren was there immediately, one arm around her shoulders. "You okay?" Maren asked. "I just want one day," Lynette said softly. "One day where my son isn't a story or a tragedy or an inspiration, just a boy having a birthday party." "He's got that," Flint said, "and we'll make sure he keeps it." He turned to Silas and Cade. "Watch the street. Anyone else shows up with cameras, turn them around before they get close." They nodded and moved into position, casual but alert. The party resumed its warmth, but with a new undercurrent, protective, defensive. The bikers had come to honor a promise. Now they stayed to guard the peace that promise had created. Back in the yard, unaware of the drama at the gate, Declan was opening presents. The model airplane from Cade, books from Maren, the leather bracelet from Bridger that he immediately put on and refused to remove. Action figures, art supplies, a basketball, a telescope. Gifts that said, "We see you as a whole person with a future." The afternoon sun peaked harsh and white over Henderson as the party reached its peak energy. Children ran in circles, their laughter mixing with the deep rumble of biker voices. Ronan's guitar had been joined by a harmonica someone produced, creating an impromptu concert that drew neighbors closer still. The fence line between private and public dissolved as the celebration spilled over, not invasive, but inclusive, welcoming. Declan sat in the middle of it all, face paint applied by Maren, turning him into a fierce tiger. Surrounded by classmates who'd forgotten to be afraid, Emma had recruited him for a game of tag. Marcus was teaching him the chant from their school's football team. For 2 hours, he'd been just a 9-year-old boy having the birthday party he deserved. Then the second van arrived. This one was larger, marked with the logo of a Reno television station. It parked directly across the street, and before Flint or the others could intercept, a reporter was out and approaching with a cameraman in tow. Not Derek Morrison's sly approach, but bold and direct. "Garrett Mercer?" the woman called, her voice practiced and projecting. "Rebecca Torres, Channel 7 News. Can we have a word?" Flint's jaw tightened. The use of his full name was deliberate, meant to show she'd done her homework, that she couldn't be dismissed as easily as a local newspaper. He moved to intercept her before she could reach the yard. "Private property. Private event. Public street," Rebecca countered, gesturing to where she stood on the sidewalk. "And a man with your particular history showing up at a child's birthday party with 92 other bikers. That's absolutely newsworthy, especially when several of those men have criminal records." The words landed like grenades. Several bikers stiffened. Ronan's guitar went silent. The children, sensing something wrong in the way adults do, grew quiet. Lynette appeared at Flint's side, voice shaking with controlled fury. "You need to leave now." "Miss Ashford, is it true you weren't aware of Mr. Mercer's background when you allowed him access to your son? That he served time in Nevada State Prison for—" "Stop!" Flint's word cut through her sentence. "You want to talk about my past? Fine, but not here. Not now, and not where that boy can hear you turn something good into something cheap and ugly." Rebecca's smile was sharp. "So you don't deny the conviction? Assault with a deadly weapon, 5 years served, released 2018. That's public record, Mr. Mercer." "And irrelevant," Mrs. Patterson said, stepping between them. "What's relevant is that this man kept a promise to a child when the rest of us didn't. What's relevant is that 93 people rode nearly 60 miles to make sure a sick boy knew he mattered. What's relevant is that you're trying to poison something pure because it makes better television. What's relevant," Rebecca pressed, "is whether parents knew they were allowing their children to attend a party hosted by convicted felons." "We're not hosting anything," Ronan interrupted, voice tight. "We're guests, big difference." "And we're leaving," Flint said quietly. He turned to the other riders. "Pack it up, we're out." A protest rippled through the assembly. Bridger shook his head. "We're not letting some vulture chase us off. We're not being chased. We're choosing." Flint's voice was firm. "We came to give that kid a good birthday, not to make it complicated for his mother. Not to give ammunition to people who want to make this about our pasts instead of his present." He looked at Lynette. "I'm sorry. This got too big, too visible. That's on me." "No!" Lynette started, but Flint was already moving back to the yard. The bikers, reading his intention, began their own quiet preparations to leave. Engines were checked, gear was secured, the withdrawal was orderly, dignified, but it carried the weight of defeat nonetheless. Declan saw them preparing to go and pushed through the crowd. "What's happening? Why are you leaving?" Flint knelt to his level. "Had to cut out earlier than planned, kid. But you had a good party, right?" "The best." Declan's eyes were filling with tears. "But you can't go. We haven't done the thing yet." "What thing?" "The ride." Declan's voice broke. "You said in June that maybe someday you'd take me on a ride. Please don't go without. Please." Flint looked at Lynette. She stood torn between protecting her son and protecting him from disappointment, between keeping him safe from perceived danger and letting him experience something he desperately wanted. Rebecca Torres stood at the fence line, camera rolling, documenting the emotional moment with the calculated awareness that this was her money shot. The sick kid crying, the convicted felon, the moral ambiguity she could edit into whatever narrative drove the most clicks. "Absolutely not," Lynette said finally. "I'm not putting my son on a motorcycle with—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung heavy. Flint stood slowly. "Understood. Take care of yourself, Declan. Happy birthday." He walked toward his bike. The other riders followed. One by one, engines roared to life. The sound that had arrived that morning as promise now felt like farewell. Declan broke away from his mother and ran after Flint. "Please, you said you'd come and you did. You kept your promise, but this was part of it too." "Your mother said no, kid. That's final." "Then you didn't really keep your promise." The words exploded out of him. 9 years of being told no for his own safety, being kept from normal experiences because he was fragile, being treated like his wish list didn't matter as much as everyone else's fear. "You said maybe someday, and everyone always says that. They say maybe and later and we'll see, and they never mean it." The accusation hit harder than anything Rebecca Torres had thrown. Flint stopped, one leg already swung over his bike. He looked at the boy, face paint smeared with tears, thin arms wrapped around himself, medical port visible at his collarbone, and saw not just Declan but every broken promise he'd ever witnessed. "Lynette," Maren said quietly, appearing beside her. "May I speak with you? Alone." The two women stepped aside. Maren spoke in low, urgent tones. "I know you're scared. I know letting your sick child do something risky goes against every instinct you have. But I watched my son die, never having done half the things he dreamed of, because I was protecting him. And you know what I learned? Sometimes protection is just fear wearing a disguise. Sometimes the risk is what they need. He could get hurt. He's already hurting. Look at him." Maren gestured to where Declan stood beside Flint's bike, shoulders shaking. "Not from illness. From being treated like his life is just about surviving instead of living. Flint will keep him safer than anyone. He's ridden more miles than most people drive in a lifetime, and your son will remember this forever, whichever choice you make." Lynette looked at her son, at the bikers waiting patiently, at Rebecca Torres still filming, still ready to spin this into evidence of reckless endangerment or touching triumph, depending on what happened next. She walked over to Flint. "One condition." He waited. "I go too. on the back of someone's bike. I watch him the whole time." Flint's expression shifted. Respect bloomed. "Fair. Maren can take you. She's been riding 20 years. He looked down at Declan. "You still want this?" The boy nodded so hard his whole body shook. "Then let's ride. But first," Flint pulled out his phone and dialed. When someone answered, he said simply, "Need a helmet. Child-sized, fast." 20 minutes later, a rider who'd left earlier returned with a bright blue helmet, properly fitted. Flint checked it 3 times, adjusted the straps, made sure it sat secure. Then he showed Declan how to climb on behind him, where to put his feet, where to hold on. "Tight but not panicked," Flint instructed. "When I lean, you lean with me. Stay loose. Trust me to do the work. Can you do that?" "Yes," Declan whispered. Lynette climbed on behind Maren, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She'd never been on a motorcycle in her life, never planned to be. But love makes us brave. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to leave a like. It helps us reach more people with stories that matter. The convoy reformed, smaller now, just 20 bikes. The others had gone ahead to clear the route, to make sure no obstacles or hazards waited. Flint led, Declan pressed against his back, small hands gripping his vest. Lynette rode behind with Maren, watching her son with fierce intensity. They didn't go fast, didn't show off. The ride was gentle, deliberate, a circuit through Henderson that let Declan feel wind and freedom and power without danger. They rode past the clinic where he'd met Flint in June, past the school where classmates had ignored him, past streets that had witnessed his isolation. And everywhere they went, people stopped to watch, not with fear or judgment, but with something else. Witness, acknowledgement that something meaningful was passing through. On the bike, Declan's grip loosened from terror to trust. His body relaxed against Flint's broad back. And in that relaxation came something profound, the understanding that being careful didn't have to mean being afraid, that people could see him as fragile and still give him strength. The 20-bike convoy moved through Henderson like a river of chrome and purpose, engines throttled low, respectful, not roaring. Flint kept his speed careful, hyper-aware of the small body pressed against his back, the thin arms wrapped around his waist, the trust that felt heavier than any other cargo he'd ever carried. Declan's grip had shifted from desperate to confident. Through the helmet, Flint could hear small sounds of wonder, gasps when they leaned into a turn, a laugh when they picked up speed on a straightaway. The boy was experiencing something most people never really understand, the difference between being carried and being freed. Lynette, riding behind Maren, experienced her own transformation. The terror that seized her chest when they'd first pulled away had gradually loosened into something else. Not comfort exactly, but recognition. Watching her son, this child she'd wrapped in cotton wool for 3 years, this fragile life she'd guarded with such ferocity that she'd sometimes forgotten he needed to live and not just survive. Watching him now, she saw what she'd been protecting him from wasn't just danger, it was joy. The route Flint chose was deliberate. They passed Silver Creek Park, where Declan used to play before the diagnosis, before hospital visits replaced playground visits. They rode past the elementary school, now quiet on Saturday, past the baseball field, where kids Declan's age played summer leagues he'd never been allowed to join. Each location was a marker in the geography of a childhood interrupted. But on the bike, moving through these spaces with the sun warm on his face and the wind buffeting his small frame, Declan was reclaiming them. Not as places he'd been denied access to, but as parts of a town that was his just as much as anyone else's. They reached the edge of Henderson where the houses thinned and desert reasserted itself. Flint pulled the convoy to a stop at a scenic overlook, a small, cleared area where the land dropped away to show miles of Nevada's austere beauty. Sagebrush and sky, mountains in the distance, wearing their late afternoon colors. He helped Declan off the bike carefully, making sure the boy's legs were steady after the ride. Lynette rushed over, her own legs unsteady for different reasons. "You okay, baby?" She dropped to her knees, hands checking him over with practiced medical thoroughness. "Mom." Declan's voice was different, stronger. "I'm fine, better than fine. That was... I can't even..." He turned to Flint. "Thank you." Flint removed his own helmet, running one hand through flattened hair. "You did good, kid. Followed instructions, stayed loose. Natural rider." "Really? Really?" The other bikers dismounted, gathering at the overlook. Ronan brought water bottles from his saddlebag. Bridger produced trail mix that he passed around. This stop wasn't planned, but it felt necessary. A moment to catch breath and mark what had just happened. Mrs. Patterson had followed in her car, unable to leave even though the party had technically ended. She approached Lynette, voice tentative. "That was incredibly brave, both of you." Lynette laughed, shaky and real. "Brave or crazy, I'm still deciding." "Brave," Marin said firmly. She dismounted and stood with her arm around Lynette's shoulders, this sudden sisterhood forged in shared understanding of what it costs to let your child risk flying. "Definitely brave." Declan had wandered to the edge of the overlook, staring at the landscape with an intensity that drew Flint after him. The man stood beside the boy, both looking at the same view but seeing different things. "My dad left when I was 5, Declan said suddenly, "when the doctors said I was sick, just didn't come home one day." Flint said nothing. Sometimes silence is the only appropriate response to pain. "Mom says it wasn't about me, that some people can't handle hard things, but I think maybe it was about me, maybe I wasn't worth staying for." "That's not how it works," Flint said quietly. "People who leave when things get tough, that's about their weakness, not your worth. Your value doesn't decrease because someone was too coward to see it." "How do you know?" "Because I left things once, important things, and it wasn't because they didn't matter. It was because I was scared I'd fail them." Flint paused, weighing how much truth to share with a 9-year-old. "I served in Afghanistan, had a team, my unit. We were family, but I came home different, angry, with pieces of myself missing, started fights. I served in Afghanistan, had a team, my unit. We were family, but I came home different, angry, with pieces of myself missing, started fights, made bad choices, hurt people who didn't deserve it." Flint's voice was steady, factual. "Spent 5 years in prison for it. Came out still broken. But the road taught me something. Running doesn't fix you. Facing things does. Keeping promises does." Declan absorbed this. "So you came to my birthday because you're trying to be better." "I came because I said I would. But yeah, being better is part of it, making sure when I give my word it means something." "It does," Declan said fiercely. "It means everything." Behind them, Rebecca Torres's camera crew had somehow tracked their location. She approached with her cameraman, microphone ready, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson stepped directly into frame. "Rebecca, I'm speaking on record now. What you're witnessing isn't a story about criminals endangering children. It's about a community failing a child and strangers doing what we should have done. I'm ashamed I didn't make sure Declan's classmates came to his party. These people did better than us." Emma Henderson's mother pushed forward next. "My daughter is here because these men showed us what courage looks like. Not the courage to judge or exclude, the courage to show up." One by one, parents who'd kept their distance stepped into view, speaking not to defend the bikers, but to acknowledge their own failures. Rebecca's ambush piece was transforming before her eyes into something she couldn't control or spin. Flint watched this unfold, then turned back to Declan, ready to head back. "Can we go fast? Just once?" Flint looked at Lynette. She took a breath, then nodded. Once, but not too fast. The return ride was different. Flint let the engine open up on a long straightaway. Not reckless, but free. Declan's whoop of joy carried over the wind, pure and unfiltered. It was the sound of a child remembering he had a future worth speeding toward. By the time they returned to Oak Ridge Street, the sun hung low and golden. The party had naturally wound down, classmates retrieved by parents, decorations sagging in evening breeze. But something had shifted in Henderson that day. A boy had been seen. Promises had been kept. And a town had been reminded that community meant showing up for the uncomfortable, not just the convenient. The bikers prepared to leave for real this time. Engines were checked, routes planned. They'd given Declan his birthday. Now the road called them back to their own lives. Declan stood on the porch, Lynette's arm around his shoulders, watching the preparations with visible sadness. "Will I see you again?" he asked Flint. "Maybe." Flint didn't believe in false promises. "Road takes me lots of places, but I'll remember you, kid. That counts for something. It counts for everything." Declan pulled off the leather bracelet Bridger had given him, promises kept, and held it out. "Keep this, so you remember that promises matter. And so when you're somewhere far away, you'll think about today." Flint's throat tightened. He took the bracelet, worn leather warm from the boy's wrist, and fastened it around his own. "Deal. And you keep remembering that being sick doesn't make you less. Different doesn't mean weak. You're strong, Declan. Stronger than most adults I know." Bridger approached with an envelope. "From all of us. Not much, but it'll help with medical bills." Lynette opened it and went pale. Nearly $4,000 in cash and checks. "I can't accept this." "You can and you will," Maren said firmly. "We all contributed. Some of us know what those bills look like. Use it for something that makes his life better. A trip, a toy, whatever he needs." One by one, the bikers said goodbye. Not with fanfare, but with quiet dignity. Handshakes for Declan that treated him as an equal. Hugs for Lynette that conveyed understanding. Nods to neighbors who'd gathered to witness the departure. Ronan was last. He pressed something into Declan's hand. A guitar pick, worn smooth by years of use. "For when you're older, learn to play. Music helps when words fail." Then they mounted up. 93 engines roared to life in perfect synchronization. The sound shook windows, one last time, a final reminder of what showing up looked like. But as Flint prepared to kick his bike into gear, Declan ran into the street. "Wait!" Flint killed the engine. The boy approached, face serious despite tears streaming down his cheeks. "Next year," Declan said, "will you come back? For my 10th birthday?" Flint looked at this child who'd taught him that promises still mattered in a cynical world. Who'd reminded 93 road-worn adults that honor wasn't dead, just forgotten. Who'd shown a town that worth wasn't measured in health or conformity, but in courage and heart. "I'll be here," Flint said. "Not maybe, not if I can, a promise. And I'll bring everyone." Declan's face transformed. "Really? Really? You've got my word." The boy threw his arms around Flint's waist one more time, this fierce hug that contained 3 years of being overlooked and 1 day of being seen. When he stepped back, something had changed in his posture. He stood straighter, looked taller, carried himself like someone who knew he mattered. The convoy rolled out as evening descended. They left behind a small house decorated with streamers, a yard trampled by celebration, and a community forced to examine what it meant to truly see each other. Rebecca Torres got her story, but not the one she'd hunted for. Instead, she captured something real. Redemption isn't loud or convenient. It's kept in leather bracelets and birthday promises. It's 93 strangers riding 60 miles because a child asked them to. 6 months passed. Winter came to Nevada, harsh and unforgiving. Declan's treatments continued, good days and bad, progress and setbacks, the exhausting rhythm of fighting an invisible enemy. But something was different now. At school, Emma sat with him at lunch. Marcus invited him to birthday parties. Mrs. Patterson called on him in class, not with pity, but with expectation. The other children had learned from their parents' shame. Exclusion was the real disease. Lynette watched her son change. Not in his medical condition. That remained its own battle. But in how he carried himself. The leather bracelet Bridger had given him never left his wrist. The guitar pick from Ronan stayed in his pocket. In talismanic, the photos Marin had taken covered his bedroom walls, visual proof that he'd been worth showing up for. In February, an envelope arrived. No return address, just a Nevada postmark. Inside was a single photograph. Flint on his motorcycle, somewhere in Arizona desert, holding up a sign that read 149 days until your birthday. Still counting. Lynette found Declan crying over the photo. Not sad tears, but the overwhelmed kind that come when someone remembers you exist beyond their line of sight. More photos arrived monthly. Flint in Colorado, Montana, Washington State. Each one counting down, each one proving that promises lived in action, not words. Other bikers sent postcards. Marin from Texas, Bridger from California, Ronan from Oregon. 93 people scattered across the country, all counting toward September 14th. By August, the anticipation was unbearable. Declan marked each day on his calendar with careful precision. Lynette found herself planning obsessively, wanting this year to match last year's magic while knowing that wasn't possible. Lightning didn't strike twice, but on September 14th, at 6:47 a.m., her phone rang. "Ma'am, it's Flint. We're 40 miles out. Thought you should know." Her heart stopped. How many? More than last year. Word spread. People heard the story. They wanted to be part of it. At 9:30 a.m., the rumble started. Deeper than last year. Longer. Declan pressed his face to the window, eyes wide with disbelief as they appeared on the horizon. Not 93 motorcycles, 147. The convoy stretched back so far the end wasn't visible. Flint led at the front, the leather bracelet still on his wrist. Behind him rode Ronan, Bridger, Marin, Cade, Silas, all the originals. But they were joined by others, veterans who'd heard about keeping promises, parents who'd lost children and wanted to honor one who lived, strangers who believed the world needed more showing up and less standing back. They lined Oak Ridge Street and the 3 blocks beyond. Henderson had never seen anything like it. The mayor came. Local news ran positive stories this time. Rebecca Torres issued a public apology. But none of that mattered to Declan. What mattered was that Flint had kept his word. Again. Had taught him that in a world full of maybes and will sees and probably nots, some people still believed in definitely and always, and I promise. The party was bigger, wilder, more joyful. But the most important moment came quietly, away from crowds. Flint and Declan sitting on the porch steps as the celebration roared around them. "You came back," Declan said. "Said I would. Will you come back next year?" Flint looked at this boy, now 10, stronger than last year, still fighting, but fighting with hope. "Every year until you tell me to stop." "What if I never tell you to stop?" "Then I guess you're stuck with me." Declan smiled, leaning against Flint's shoulder. "Good. I want to be stuck with you." Around them, 147 motorcycles gleamed in September sun. Behind them, a town that had learned to see differently. Ahead, a future measured not in limitations, but in promises kept. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a child who'd learned he was worth showing up for, and a man who'd learned that redemption lived in the smallest gestures carried out with the greatest faithfulness. The road had taught them both. Some destinations aren't places. They're promises kept again and again until they become who you are. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another confession from the road. These are the stories that remind us honor still exists, promises still matter, and showing up is the most powerful thing we can do for each other. Until the next ride, keep your word and ride free.